Afternoon, folks. So today I have come back to the Jurassic Coast and I'm heading up towards Golden Cap. So in my last video I was doing some vibe coding up at Stone Barrow, and I talked about Golden Cap in that video, and today I've come back because it's another lovely sunny day. I'm currently walking through Langdon Wood at the moment. So I've come up to Langdon Wood this time to get to Golden Cap. There are three ways to get to Golden Cap. You can come up from Seatown and the Anchor Inn. You can go from Stone Barrow, or you can come from Langdon Woods. And it's kind of appropriate, really, coming up here today, because I suppose coming to Golden Cap and the three different directions of getting to Golden Cap are indicative of the three different ways, probably the best way to describe it, that you can go around or go about doing a CIAM implementation. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is, what is a CIAM implementation or CIAM integration or combination of both, and what does it give you? Why, as an application developer, as a B2B or B2C SaaS application developer, would you consider doing it? What are the various parts of it, and how does it all fit together? And so that got me thinking about some of the articles that I've currently published, and I realised that what I really needed is a way to tie a few concepts together. They were a bit loose. There's some holes in the articles, or the collection of articles that I've written, so gave me some ideas for some new articles, but also gave me an idea for this walk and talk video as some sort of overarching kind of way of bringing these things together. So I'm going to talk about CIAM from the perspective of a application independent service, which you can implement yourself. I'm going to suggest you don't, and I describe that more in the article I've written. I'll share a link to that here. You could implement that by subscribing to some third-party CIAM SaaS vendor, or you could take the DIY approach. And when people talk about CIAM as a service, I think that's maybe where that degree of, or those three options, the availability of those three options becomes maybe somewhat blurred, and people suddenly think, oh, I've either got to build this all myself, or I'm going to get charged a lot of money to subscribe to a third-party service. So I'm going to talk about the architecture of a CIAM SaaS solution. How you decide you want to implement it, I guess, is largely up to you, but I'm favouring the DIY approach as the most cost-effective way to do that. So in order to talk about the CIAM architecture, I'm going to split it into four discrete areas. They're related and they have a bearing on one another, but if we break them down into four discrete areas, then they're easier to manage. And those four areas are authentication, authorization, management, and protection, or as I like to call them on Discover CIAM, authenticate, authorize, manage, and protect. Okay, I've just popped out of Langdon Wood to back me there through the gate, and I'm just in the meadow heading up to Golden Cap. So I'm going to go up to the top there. Golden Cap rises 626 feet above the sea level, approximately above the sea level. And yeah, I've switched to my kind of windproof, fingers crossed, microphone, because it is quite blowy up here and you will get a lot of wind noise otherwise. So let's first of all talk about, as we walk through the meadow and go up, I'll probably stop a couple of times. Walking and talking kind of takes it out of you a bit. Let's talk about authentication. So particularly if you're a B2B SaaS vendor, you are faced with building some federated integration for authentication. And even as a B2C vendor, you are faced with potentially using social authentication, leveraging MFA, and a number of other things that I'll talk about. So you either add that to what you've already built, and now you have to deal with not just user IDs and passwords, but you have to deal with tokens and assertions. Talk about that more in a little while. And then you have some customers who may want to pay you a lot of money, but they've got federated connections that use legacy Kerberos systems or LDAP systems, and you have to integrate with those. And as you go, you end up moving away from concentrating solely on the core of your application and your business, and end up kind of building actually identity as a service, or authentication, an authentication service anyway. And an authentication service is often referred to as an IDP, an identity provider. And an identity provider is an application independent service which is designed to handle the authentication process and the various nuances associated with that, and the various technologies that get associated with that. Now, modern technology or modern protocols such as SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language, particularly prevalent in B2B scenarios, OpenID Connect, particularly prevalent in pretty much all of the customer identity scenarios, just trying to work out how to open this gate, are protocols you have to understand and implement if you build an IDP yourself, or you could leverage a third-party SaaS vendor who's already done all of that work and integrate with their service, or you can go the DIY route. And instead of building implementation, you could deploy already built implementation that effectively uses open source technology. Langdon Wood, we came from there. Langdon Hill, kind of entry to Golden Cap is so much easier. But I thought I'd just do a panoramic shot with the actual rear-facing camera, predominantly because I can then zoom in. That's the beach. I'll probably go down there a little later on. There's a nice pub down there. And I'll just give you a panoramic view over the hills. So I talked about a couple of things in relation to authentication. I was mentioning social authentication, I mentioned federated authentication. I mentioned tokens and assertions. Modern IDPs favor best practice protocols, and today those are OpenID Connect, SAML, because that's a kind of I call it a legacy protocol, but it's a protocol that B2B SaaS applications tend to need to leverage because it's favored by enterprises and enterprise type organizations, simply because with SAML assertions and the SAML protocol, there's a trust relationship that's built up. And in a lot of organizational context, that trust relationship is important. So those are the types of things you have to deal with. ID tokens are in JWT format. JWT format is like JSON, but it's signed. It has a cryptographic signature, so you have to deal with managing that and handling that, validating the signature, and kind of making sure that everything is correct. SAML assertions are in XML, so you have to deal with XML documents, and you have to process the various vagaries of XML. And both from a token and an assertion point of view, there are claims, otherwise known as attributes, depending on which protocol you're using, that you have to process and validate to make sure that everything is correct. Now, social authentication is really useful in both B2C scenarios and in some B2B SaaS scenarios as well. Processing user IDs and passwords is laborious. It's compute intensive, it requires a large number of resources, and in my article, Anatomy of a Password, I discussed kind of what's involved with processing passwords in password authentication scenarios, the kind of cryptography that you have to do, the kind of hashing that you have to do, and the algorithms you have to use. So that's laborious and can be time consuming, but it can also be very costly to do. And social authentication allows you to go what I like to call password free. It means you can remove your reliance on passwords by getting someone else to process them, getting a third party that is geared up and has the scale to process passwords. And you're doing that in a federation scenario as well, because you're handing that off to the IDP associated with the organization that subscribe to you. But there's a crucial part to that, which is what's typically known as account linking. And without that particular piece, all of the other aspects of social and federation that form part of an umbrella known as SSO really kind of, it doesn't necessarily fall apart, but it becomes a lot more challenging, because account linking is going to give you a way of leveraging multiple third parties and multiple third party IDPs, whether they be from a federated scenario or from a social scenario, and associate them all with the one account that you have for a particular user. And that's important because it preserves user context. It allows the user to maintain a seamless experience no matter how they log in. This is the plinth that talks about what Golden Cap is all about and how it was bequeathed to the National Trust. And of course, there are other technologies that you have to look at as well. Things like passwordless authentication using WebAuthn and Passkeys, which is the new kid on the block, as it were, from a passwordless authentication perspective. And so this all takes away from what is essentially your core business. You therefore need some sort of centralized service, so you might as well leverage a centralized service that's already been built for you, an IDP that's already been put together. And there are other considerations as well. Abilities to do a number of self-service capability. And I'll touch more on that in the management side of things, but self-service kind of helps to protect against a lot of the attack vectors. And I've mentioned attack vectors a number of times. And a lot of the attack vectors actually come as a result of password-based authentication. So if you can get rid of password-based authentication, offload it, go password-free, go passwordless, then you're saving yourself the requirement of either having to subscribe to a lot of the attack vectors protection, or have protection from those attack vectors be something that is costly in a DIY scenario. Let's talk about authorization. Now, authorization becomes a lot clearer, I think, than authentication, really. But authorization leverages authentication. And in the context I'm going to talk about, it specifically leverages an IDP. Now, authorization in a service type model is provided by an authorization server, and an authorization server really has two distinct aspects. So one aspect is in processing consent, and consent is something that was introduced with the OAuth 2 protocol, in that it allows a user to give consent to accessing resources on their behalf. So a user can give an application their consent to access resources on their behalf. And resources are typically accessed via an API. So OAuth 2 is really the protocol to support API access. Now, there are other ways of accessing APIs, I'll touch on those in a minute, but let's just cover the other side of, or the other aspect from an authorization perspective, and that is access control. So an authorization server often has the capability to perform access control functions, which often fall into the categories of things like role-based access control, etc. Now, the definition of an authorization server in OAuth 2 terms isn't as broad of a scope as access control. It really is just consent, but the notion of an authorization server brings access control into play as well. And access control models, I mentioned role-based access control. You've probably heard of attribute-based access control. There is relationship-based access control, and quite a number of other access control models. Policy-based access control is one, for example, that springs to mind. And you can read more about those and discover CIAM. An authorization server, in a similar way to an IDP, is providing authorization as a service, leveraging OAuth 2. We leverage this thing called an access token. Now, I mentioned API keys earlier, and access tokens are a corollary, I suppose, to the API key, but with a number of differences. So unlike an API key, an access token is typically generated in the context of a user with the user's consent, with the associated ability to check permissions for that user. And that key is kind of self-managed. It has a lifetime associated with it, therefore it will automatically expire. And if I need a new one, I can use various mechanisms to get one. will be delivered as JWTs, and in that case they contain claims, they're signed, their signatures are cryptographically secure. You know they come from an authenticated and trusted source, and they effectively are providing a self-contained artifact that has claims, think of them as attributes, associated with a user. That means they have a context. They allow access to resources via the API in an auditable fashion. You know who's accessing or requesting access to those resources. You can audit that, produce an audit trail. You know exactly what's happening. And that is something you can't do with API keys. So a service level approach, independent application, IDP, Authorization Server, but a service level approach to CIAM. Kind of by virtue means an API first approach. And from a management perspective, that's really beneficial. So what does management actually look like? Well, there's management from a perspective of the service deployment, configuration, and there's management from the perspective of self-service management, particularly for users in either a B2C or B2B SaaS configuration, where users can make changes to their own profiles. And with the account linking mechanisms that we talked about, or I talked about in authentication, then being able to manage those as well in a self-service fashion. And that self-service management reduces a lot of burden on potential help desk scenarios, but also removing the human factor from the equation in a lot of those management scenarios also makes things more secure. And then there's management as well from a brand perspective, and that really does come into play with B2B SaaS solutions, because in B2B scenarios, your customers, who are organizations, really want to be able to bring their own brand to the applications and services they deploy within their corporate environment, let's put it that way. Obviously, with a SaaS solution, you're hosting it and you're providing hosting infrastructure, but it's within their corporate environment. So having the ability to brand, both from the perspective of assisted branding, where you as the vendor will assist your subscriber in the branding process, and self-service branding is really important. Management in terms of leveraging an API first approach, which comes by default as a kind of service configuration, independent identity provider, independent authorization server, whether or not those are combined into one, means that integrating with continuous integration and continuous deployment workflows that you'll typically find as part of a B2B or B2C application, solution, SaaS, whatever you want to call it, development, makes it a lot easier. And that includes testing as well. So you can build independent test suites as part of your CI/CD pipeline, or however you deploy, and integrate those as part of an API first approach as well. So managing your CIAM integration becomes something that's a lot more manageable from both a configuration perspective, a self-service perspective, a brand name perspective, and all points in between. Let's talk about protection. This is the last of the sections that I mentioned at the beginning. And, you know, it comes in a number of different guises. We've talked, I think, about some of the attack protection scenarios, and based on some of the attack vectors that are related to using passwords, and how you can mitigate those by going password free, using a social provider if you're a B2C application, but also for registration purposes in a B2B SaaS application, but that you also get when you leverage federation in a B2B SaaS scenario. It doesn't cover all of those scenarios, all password related from an attack protection point of view, and from perspective of APIs, things like rate limiting are something you can employ whilst using the likes of OAuth 2, means that you have a much better control over and visibility into potential attacks on your APIs from a audit and audit control compliance perspective. But of course, there's also infrastructure protection and protection from the focus for regulatory compliance. Let's put it that way. If you aren't regulatory compliant and you get audited, then that can be problematic, because that can be a very costly affair. And just going back there to what I said about infrastructure protection, DIY deployment scenarios, I guess, expose your infrastructure potentially more than if you were to use a third-party SaaS CIAM vendor solution. And a lot of what you're paying for with a third party is in taking some of that responsibility. But it all depends on how your integration works and how your integration goes. And certainly protection from cost escalation can be challenging in some circumstances, especially if you are leveraging authentication contexts which aren't associated with the user. So most third-party SaaS solutions will charge based on what they term as MAU, monthly active users, the number of independent individual users that authenticate to their platforms every month, or to your application via their platform every month. And they will typically have a price point for those, and also typically have a price point for authentication in what's often referred to as a machine context, i.e. a non-user context where some sort of service that you have, some sort of daemon service that you have that's running on a periodic basis, needs to authenticate and get tokens for accessing your infrastructure via the third-party SaaS CIAM platform. So those, if you're not careful, can rack up costs quite considerably and quite quickly. And sometimes insight into what's happening isn't always as clear as you'd like. That visibility isn't always there, so that can become challenging. Of course, you don't get that with a DIY situation because you monitor your own infrastructure that you're deploying into. And of course, from a perspective of protecting the infrastructure that potentially can be costly due to password-based attacks like brute force attacks or breach password attacks, then of course going password-free or passwordless can mitigate those scenarios. But there are some challenges there, especially in the passwordless route for your users who are maybe less familiar with the kind of passkey type strategies. So, some things to think about. And I kind of think I'm hoping this video will provide that overarching context for why you want to integrate SaaS, or integrate CIAM, I should say, into your SaaS in a way that's application independent, leveraging technologies like an IDP, an authorization server, whether they're separate or combined, additional authorization services that maybe give you complementary access control capabilities like relationship-based access controls or attribute-based access controls, and really why doing so in either a DIY or leveraging a third-party CIAM solution provider is much better than trying to build it yourself, because you've seen there's a lot to think about if you build it yourself. So I'm going to leave you now with that. I'm heading back to the car. I'll be then heading off home, and all that's left for me to say is my usual sign off, which is happy coding, software development, and happy integrating with CIAM too.